So Davey Street came down here and you turned into Murray Street that way, and that's how you got into Hobart. Now this building is interesting with all the balconies and terraces and ironwork and things. You think this would be a colonial era building, but it's not, it's a fake.
G'day and welcome to Forgotten Tasmania. I'm John Stevenson and I inherited a collection of old photos. I'm going to use some of those to explore Murray Street in the 1800s. I found death and taxes, church and state, a secret society, torture, murder, tunnels, and a good stiff drink. And that's just in the first block. This street's over a mile long, who knows what else I'll find. That's the amazing thing about Hobart. We have these old buildings, and many of the secrets of the past are hiding in plain sight. Take this building on the corner. This is where Davey and Murray Streets used to start. You came down Davey Street and it ended here, and you turned into Murray Street. This building is home to the oldest surviving law firm in Australia, Butler, McIntyre and Butler. They started in 1824. You might assume that the building dates back from then too, but it's a fake. Built for Mr. George Adams in 1907, it was his family home with brick, stone and verandas that looked like a colonial building. The law firm only moved in here in the 1970s. The original building here was the Waterloo Inn, and the licensee was John Davies, of Davies Brothers, the company behind the Hobarton Mercury newspaper. The law firm has the building next door as well, but the building next to that has a dead giveaway as to its history. The Henry Hunter designed Masonic Hall was built in 1874 by the Freemasons Hall Company, headed by Mr. Charles Toby, a close personal friend of Mr. Richard Clayburn, who had a warehouse further up Murray Street. Clayburn is one of those names that keeps popping up in the development of Murray Street, but more about him later. The foundation stone from this building was moved to Sandy Bay Road when the Masons built an even grander hall. I know my dad was a Mason and I'm pretty sure his father was too. I found Dad's Masonic letters amongst his things after he died. It's often seen as a strange organisation in this day and age, but from what I can see on the website, it's just a grown-up version of the Boy Scouts for wealthy men where they can do charity work quietly and discreetly. I can see how that would have appealed to my dad. He was always very shy about the charity work and contributions that he made. I mention the Masons because there are other names on the plaque here that are familiar old Hobart names, like Coogan, Tapping, Cummings, Mather and Crisp, to name a few. It seems the movers and shakers in Hobart society were Masons. This building opened in 1859 to house the Hobart Savings Bank, which started in 1845 by George Washington Walker, a draper. Not that long ago, the building was converted to a house, and red awnings were placed above the windows. This caused a stir with the heritage people, and some were removed. Personally, I didn't mind them, but there's certainly no awnings in the old photographs I have. The inside of this building used to be very grand. I'm trying to get in when it's open to the public, but I missed out 2 years in a row. Next to that on the corner is the Durand Tamar building, dating back to 1877. The Durand Tamar Insurance Company started in 1838. I read that there were several other insurance companies around that time, but this one is the only one that survived. But these buildings are not the first use of this space. It has a much darker past. It's built on the site of the old Hobart Jail. The 1849 photo just shows the wall, but there was a painting photographed by Beattie. By 1812, the Army moved up to Anglesey Barracks on the hill to keep watch over Hobart. But they also had a presence here at the original Hobart Jail from 1817 to 1857. Justice moved fast in those days. Criminals were tried in the court across the street, sentenced, and then imprisoned or executed at the jail. The Hobart Jail had gallows that could hang 6 at a time. I find this abhorrent, but luckily there's gallows humour. The expressions "don't leave me hanging" and "pull my leg" relate to the situation where an unskilled executioner would leave the condemned alive dangling off the end of the rope, and they hoped their friends would grab their legs and pull down hard, breaking their neck and putting them out of their misery. I've read reports that the corpses were displayed in a gibbet, left to rot and to be seen from the street, a nasty deterrent to be sure. The strange thing is that gibbeting, or hanging in chains, was actually the required punishment by law, as the bodies of murderers were not allowed to be buried on hallowed ground. The last man to be gibbeted in the British Empire was John McKee, 5th of May 1837. His body was on display just north of Perth, Tasmania, about 450 yards off the main road, at a place now called Gibbet Hill. Women were executed but not gibbeted, because the spectacle of the hanging female body was considered unsuitable for public display. Surgeons also paid handsomely for female cadavers to dissect. While we were filming on Murray Street, I found this plaque commemorating the execution of Mary McLaughlin, the first woman to be executed in Van Diemen's Land. Following the execution, her corpse was dissected at the hospital. It was a kind of public display. The colony was male gender heavy, about 1,300 females to 11,000 males. Mostly the females would be the wives of army officers or free settlers. So the message was sent to Britain, send more women, and that they did. Women were transported for a variety of offences. But should a woman's husband die and she make the terrible mistake of staying alive and feeding the children, she risked being declared a prostitute and transported, the courts of the day being unable to explain any other way that a single woman might make it in the world. Women weren't allowed to inherit. The women's part of the Hobart Jail was called the Female Factory. By 1827 it was in such a poor state, overcrowded and insecure, that it was moved to South Hobart. The men's section of the Hobart Jail was moved to Campbell Street around 1857. Upon arrival, transported women were sent to the Female Factory to be classified. The best were assigned out as servants. They could be bought or married off. Many assigned women returned pregnant, and this was regarded as entirely the woman's doing, and probably a crime. It was the terrible shame of unwed mothers. They gave birth in the factory, their children were sent to the orphan school even though they had parents. The whole situation makes my skin crawl. If we cross over to the other side of Murray Street, we find the government and courts that dished out these punishments. The area between Macquarie, Elizabeth and Murray Streets was the Government District. Government House, the Supreme Court, Treasury, Barracks and all the British establishment was here. Murray Street was named by Governor Lachlan Macquarie after Captain John Murray, Commandant of Hobart Town in 1810. Macquarie went on a naming spree tour of Van Diemen's Land in 1811, and that's where most of the street names came from. The Treasury was first envisaged in Macquarie's 1811 tour. Designed by John Lee Archer and opened in 1824, but it really consists of 9 buildings joined together. The Supreme Court 1824, Police and Convict Officers 1835, all built of red sandstone that came from the Domain Quarry. Public Offices 1840, Supreme Court 1858, Executive Council Offices 1884, built with the dark brown stone from Risdon Quarry. The rich yellow accents on the Executive Council Offices, sourced from Roseneath Quarry at Bridgewater. Deeds Building 1894, also of Risdon stone. Public Offices 1914, the sandstone came from Bryn Eston Quarry at New Norfolk. Agriculture Building 1915 and the HEC substation from 1940, both built of concrete. I love the Treasury buildings. I've been fortunate enough to see inside a few times with my previous career in IT. There's a courtroom in the middle and lots of lovely Tasmanian timber and sandstone. It's housed various state government departments, including tourism and the arts. I'm pretty sure they want to sell it off, and I worry about what will happen to it. Hobart Town Post Office, or GPO, was located here from 1862. Prior to that, it operated from this building in Murray Street, although I haven't been able to find out exactly where in Murray Street. So I've done state, now to church. Like any community organisation, the Van Diemen's Land Bible Society saw its fair share of controversy. From the location to the design, people love to disagree, but this is not the first church building, it's roughly the third. When Hobart Town was founded in 1804 by David Collins, the Reverend Robert Bobby Knopwood was there. Knopwood fed the colony and ministered to the people, starting in a bush clearing or maybe a tent. But his first dedicated church building was a wooden shack in the burial ground, which is now St David's Park. In 1811, Governor Thomas Davey obtained permission to build a better church, and sometime around 1817, a stone was laid here by William Ashton. Strangely enough, Ashton was executed across the road at the jail for bushranging not long after. The church was named in honour of David Collins and dedicated to St David, becoming St David's Cathedral. The first bishop was Reverend Nixon. There was more of that controversy over the spire, and the building changed a bit over the years. By the 1870s it was deemed unsuitable and replaced with the building we see today. The bells are very impressive, even more so up close. They're so incredibly heavy that the whole tower building has to move with them. It's an absolute art to play music on them. Another quirky feature is the stained glass at the east end behind the altar. It depicts St David holding a model of the cathedral. St David's was the place for a society wedding. Beattie's studio photographed thousands of them over the years. Apart from regular services, the church is also a magnet for tourists. Hadleys Hotel is among Australia's oldest. Originally the Tasmanian club, the building was deemed too big and John Webb was asked to run it as a hotel, becoming Webb's Family Hotel. When Webb died in 1881, the Bank of Van Diemen's Land did a deal with Francis Hadley, who had the Ship Hotel, and the bank got the land to build on the corner of Elizabeth and Collins Street. This became Hadley's Orient Hotel, the name Orient suggesting a kind of exotic allure and luxury. The Hadley family infused the hotel with its iconic Victorian-era charm. Hadleys has intriguing ties. The hotel was owned by the Bank of Van Diemen's Land, which collapsed. George Adams, founder of Tattersalls Lottery Syndicate, was known to frequent the hotel. In 1893, Hadleys Hotel was offered as second prize in Tattersalls Lottery, but withdrawn when the lottery was not fully subscribed. It was offered again in 1895 and again withdrawn. I think I've used the term white elephant at times, but the hotel has survived nearly 200 years. Hadleys has been an active sponsor of the arts. The hotel has hosted various art exhibitions and events, providing a platform for local and visiting artists alike. On the corner of Murray and Collins was this building, but it's long gone. This Art Deco Gothic fusion dates from 1937, built by the Temperance and General Mutual Life Assurance Society, aka TNG, which grew out of the Independent Order of Racobites, IOR, also known as the Sons and Daughters of Racob, from England in 1835. Their first Australian tent was in Tasmania in 1843, and then they spread across Australia. Bits were later sold off to HCF Health Fund. TNG started in 1876, and from the 1880s they built buildings in 20 places across Australia and New Zealand. The buildings were landmarks and seen as a bit of a status symbol. Your town had made it if you had a TNG building. Only 4 TNG buildings have been pulled down, so there may be still a bit of a status symbol. They merged with National Mutual in the 1980s and were bought by AXA in the 1990s. Richard Clayburn was an Irish merchant who arrived in Hobart Town in 1821. He had a business in Liverpool Street. In 1832, he brought an action against the Collector of Customs for seizing 8 casks of American tobacco on which no duty had been paid, and he had them returned to him as the law was found to be deficient. Seems he was a successful smuggler. By 1833, he had become a local deacon of the Freemasons. He was a director of the Colonial Bank and an active promoter of the Durand Tamar Insurance Company. As his business enlarged, he moved his warehouse to a capacious new building in Murray Street in 1840. He had 300 acres, including Derwent River frontage near Mount Direction. That's near the Bowen Bridge today. He had Derwent ferries at Risdon. In October 1851, he was elected for Huon to the Legislative Council, where he fought zealously against the continued transportation of convicts. He was also for the separation of Tasmania from New South Wales. His employee and good friend Charles Toby, also a Mason, was part of the Masonic Hall Company that built the hall further down Murray Street. At some point, Charles Davis had this building, and later John Watt Beatty moved in. Beatty's Port Arthur Museum was here. The building burned down in 1933, 3 years after Beatty's death. As soon as the building was rebuilt, Beatty's studio moved back in under the ownership of my grandfather, Arch Stevenson. In 1958, Hobart architects Philip Lytton, Floyd and Beatty were engaged to plan the new arcade. Beatty's studio moved out for the construction phase, but were early tenants when the arcade opened in July 1962. The studio stayed here until 1993. Apart from being the entrance to Cat and Fiddle Arcade, today the building houses the Clayburn Studio, a collective of design practices including architects. I made an extensive video about Cat and Fiddle Arcade. The Bank of New South Wales was here before Centrepoint. They became Westpac. This is Richardsons Building. I haven't been able to find out much about this building. I know it went up in the 1950s and was named after Richardson's Meats. I remember Cinema One from the 1970s that used to be in the basement, and the video arcade that accompanied it. I remember they had a club and you got extra free games on your birthday. The cinema started as the Tatler Theaterette in 1955 and was the home of the Hobart Film Society. Tatler had a matching cinema in Launceston. Bidencope's Lane used to have a hat shop where my grandmother worked for a time. I have this hat form from that shop. Polish tailor Joseph Bidencope arrived in Tasmania in 1858. He must have joined the Elizabeth Street Tailors and Drapers and found great success because he opened his own business in Murray Street around 1862, becoming the upper-class tailor of choice in Hobart. They specialised in military uniforms. Bidencope was a Mason and later appointed a Justice of the Peace in 1902. He died in 1915. I couldn't do any sort of history of Murray Street without mentioning the Meer Building. That's another of those iconic branded buildings a town just had to have. But that wasn't the first building here by a long shot. When they excavated the site, they found evidence of at least 5 buildings and coins to prove it. Apparently there was a flour mill here too. That makes sense as the rivulet runs right through here, providing water power for the 19th century machinery. Carfield House was built by George Carr Clark on this site in 1824. There were numerous merchants on this site in the 1840s. The Union Club Hotel took over the building and it became Curry's Commercial Hotel in 1873, and in 1890 the Metropolitan Hotel. The next building on this site was for Johnson & Miller Limited. Later, Brownell Brothers department store was here, in a building dated 1908. Myer didn't move in until 1959, and the Myer Christmas window came to Hobart. There was a terrible fire in 2007 that ripped a hole in Hobart's heart. The coroner's report is fascinating reading. This replacement building was started in 2010, but in 2016, excavation works caused a flood when the Hobart rivulet burst through an underground retaining wall. Myer is back, and there's a restaurant called Johnson & Miller, a nice nod to the past. Also subject to fire was the Greengate Milk Bar on the opposite corner. Greek immigrant businessman George Harros started this business in 1936. His brother-in-law was Anthony Casamatti. The Casamatti family had a restaurant called the Britannia, where George worked before he branched out on his own into the milk bar. There was a terrible accident at the Greengate in 1939 when 17-year-old waitress Beryl Eleanor Crisp tipped a pot of boiling water over herself. She later died in hospital from her burns. Presumably because of this tragedy, George invented the Harros boiler, a precursor of the modern espresso machine, which heated milk with steam. Thousands of Harros boilers were sold across the country, with manufacturing only stopping in 2015. Ron has one at the tea rooms. The Green Gate was very popular with generations of teenagers and children, as it was one of the first places to sell sugar-coated donuts and chocolate-covered ice creams. The Harros family ran the Green Gate until they sold the business around the end of the 1970s. The cafe was destroyed by fire in the mid-1980s. My dad brought back a gold Dunhill lighter from Hong Kong for Gabriel Harros in 1979. It's the same type as used by James Bond, and still highly collectible today. Harros boilers used to be further up Murray Street, where Foamland is now. Known as Leslie's Corner for many years, but the clothing store didn't start until 1902. It was bought by Edward Harry in 2004 and moved down Liverpool Street to where it is now. Leslie's Building was Burgess Brothers. It's getting a facelift again in 2023. According to Cole Dennison, the Hadleys Hotel started around 1847 as the Bath Arms Inn, Circus and Stables, although it may have been the site of an earlier hotel called the Turk's Head Inn. In 1874 it became Tattersall's Hotel, Stables and Circus, and may have been the birthplace of Ashton's Circus, but that's not confirmed. It stabled horses for hansom cabs. Highfield Hall Family Hotel opened about 1880 as an upmarket hotel, hence the term family. It became Highfield House, home of George Adams. His funeral service started there in 1904. Mainly fancy accommodation. The AMP was in there briefly, and the education department. Now it's privately owned. This Ebenezer Chapel at 220 Murray Street was built in 1869 for the United Methodists. It became the Independent Order of Oddfellows, IOOF, lodge sometime in the early 20th century, then Nightingale Supply Company, and now a private residence. These Oddfellows are an interesting bunch. From what I can see, they're a bit like the Masons, but for working class people. Another fraternity from the golden age of fraternities in the 19th century. Being a gentleman's club, the ladies were catered for with the associated Rebecca's Assembly. Like the TNG, the Oddfellows morphed into IOOF and Insignia Finance, although the order still exists. I did try looking into the history of the churches and secret societies. I saw names like Stevenson, Palfreman, Beatty, Miller, Coogan, Butler and Mather, but tracing the connection with modern businesses of the same name is difficult, and I'm not sure it gets us anywhere. Now I skipped over this, but I think we need that stiff drink I promised you earlier in the video. The Vic Tav was known as my place of drinking back in the day, but it dates back to 1836. All Hobart pubs love to claim that they're the oldest, and the Vic Tav's got some credit in that regard. It's an English pub, but the Irish gathered here in 1850 to start a petition for the release of Smith O'Brien, political prisoner. According to some, there was a tunnel across the road to the Vic Tav. I can imagine Knopwood drinking here, but I don't think he needed a tunnel to do it in secret. He'd have used the front door and dragged the Catholic priest in with him. I left these tunnels to last because they're not just in and out of the pub. There are tunnels all over linking many of these buildings. The jail had a tunnel to the courts opposite, so the prisoners could be taken to and from court without being seen in public. They appeared out of the floor like magic in the courtroom. The government employees could move between Parliament House and other buildings. The tunnels don't appear on the plans, and the keepers of the building today are emphatic that no such tunnel existed. Historian the late Peter McPhee, brother of Rob McPhee from Quantum, wrote about it in his book. Historian Colin Dennison, OAM, told me that he's been in the tunnel. The entrance was allegedly uncovered outside the Durand Tamar when the council was doing some works. And I've covered the air raid shelters under Franklin Square, but there's allegedly a bomb shelter under Parliament House. I can't wait to find out more about these forgotten tunnels of Hobart, but that's another episode. You can see the photos from this episode along with all the research, references and links on our website, forgottentasmania.com/episode/308. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers!